Let's talk about the situation analysis of the competitive environment. One of the things that marketers are looking to do is to understand what is going on in the world around them and how their businesses are operating in a large scale, macro level type of context. In order to do this, we actually have some common tools that are used to lay this groundwork to understand how to develop marketing strategy. So let's talk about what a situation analysis is first. First of all, we can describe a situation analysis, or we can define a situation analysis as the collection and interpretation of information about forces, events, and relationships in the external environment that may affect the future of the organization or the implementation of the marketing plan. So what we have here is kind of a top level going from the macro level in towards the organization itself to understand how to look at what's going on in the world around. At the macro level, we have things in the greater world. We have down a little bit deeper to the industry level or to the sector. We can look at some of the various competition, and we can look internally and reflect on what's going on in the organization, particularly as we are building it and as we're growing it. And so there are a couple of different things to consider here. First of all, we have a number of environmental forces that may be acting on the organization, whether directly on the organization or through suppliers that the organization might be working with or through customers themselves. Some of these environmental forces include social forces or technological forces, as we'll get into in our next slide, which is our first tool that we'll be using. This tool, which looks at the macro level environment, is called a CD-STEP analysis. The CD-STEP analysis effectively looks, as you can see here, kind of as a downward acrostic. It functions to look at the different cultural elements that are going on in the macro level of environment. It looks at the demographics at the period of time in that macro level environment, the different social elements, the different technological elements, the different economic elements, and the different political elements. And some might even add onto this some of the ecological elements that are going on in the broad environment, actual physical environment, and the environmental world that are going on as well. One of the reasons why doing this step is important is because it causes us to, of course, causes the organization to reflect on what is going on in the macro level world contextually at any given time. From there, we actually can use the CD-STEP analysis to form the basis of our next tool, which looks at the industry. This is our 5Cs analysis, and as you can see here, the first C for context or climate often draws on the CD-STEP analysis. What this analysis allows us to do is to look at these different elements that affect the industry, not necessarily broadly in the context of everything that's going on in the world, not necessarily narrowly in terms of competition or the organization, but looks at what may also be affecting any other types of competitors and so on. So you can see here, aside from the context and climate, organizations must look at the customers, what's going on with them. So this is all requires some market research there. They should look at competitors, what's going on in the industry as a competition and competitive forces, and we'll talk about that in our next tool. We can talk about what's going on in the company and what types of elements there are that might be beneficial, not beneficial, and so forth. And also to look at different collaborators and what's going on with them, sort of as we discussed previously in the CD-STEP analysis. But in this context, we're going to, again, look not necessarily at collaborators and distributors and so forth in a broad context, but more narrowly to the industry as a whole. Our third tool looks at competitors or competition, and this tool was developed by Michael Porter out of Harvard Business School. It's commonly used. It's called Porter's Five Forces, and what these five forces look at is the forces that act on any industry competition that other industry elements are dealing with as well in their strategic planning. The first force is the threat of new entrants. What this one actually allows is us to an organization to see is whether or not it is easy or difficult for an organization to come in and kind of create its own competitive strategy in that industry. For example, when the airlines wants to, when somebody wants to create a new airline, it is not that easy because there is a high cost of capital. There are a lot of regulations to otherwise consider, and so for a new entrance into the aircraft industry, into the airline industry, not necessarily that easy. We've also seen this in the automotive industry up until the last few years. Right? There are many different regulations. There's a high cost of capital, and therefore it's difficult for a new entrant to come onto the scene. So in that industry, we might say that the threat of new entrants is relatively low. As you see here on the left, these different threats or forces can be ranked depending on the industry and depending on the current state of events from high to medium to low. The second force is the bargaining power of buyers. Sometimes those buyers are direct customers, sometimes they're the end consumers. The third force is the availability of substitutes, whether or not there are any competition where a buyer or a supplier can go elsewhere in the marketplace. The fourth is the bargaining power of suppliers. And the fifth is the intensity of rivalry in the industry. For industries that have more competition, obviously there is a much more intense rivalry. At the same time, industries that maybe are monopolistic or not so much monopolistic, but duopolistic, where there are few competitors, think Coke and Pepsi, for example. The intensity of rivalry may still be fairly high, but because there is little competition, there is not many other places where suppliers or buyers can go. There are not necessarily many substitutes, so the competitive forces in the industry change as well. For our fourth tool, we have the one that is commonly and well known among many businesses, a SWOT analysis. What a SWOT analysis does is it looks at the internal and external strengths and weaknesses, or positives and negatives, for the organization. Why I like this particular grid here is because it actually has a couple of questions that you may wish to consider in any formation or formulation of a SWOT analysis. If we look at a little bit more of a developed SWOT analysis, Devin Schultz a couple of years ago had actually decided that looking at the external environment, both the negative threats and the potential for opportunities, the positive opportunities, would work better than starting off internally with the organizational capabilities, than starting internally with strengths and weaknesses. What they had decided was to kind of look backwards at this and say, what if we called this a TOES model and start with the threats and opportunities, the things that were going on in the world around us, which we've already, to this point, if we've used the preceding three tools, have gotten a good sense of. We use those and identify those threats, we identify those opportunities, we leverage the organizational capabilities in terms of our own company's strengths and weaknesses, and then we leverage those strengths and weaknesses to create strategy that either addresses critical threats or creates promising opportunities for the future. And so this is kind of a maybe more refined way of looking at the SWOT analysis than just dumping it straight into here's what it is externally to the company, here's what it is internally, and what do we do next. So with that, you may wish to try the process of doing some research about all of those things in the CDSTEP analysis, looking at the 5 C's, refining it further into competition and the 5 forces, and ultimately executing on a TOES analysis, and give it a try with a company like Macy's. I think many of you maybe are familiar with Macy's, one of the largest American retailers, traditionally found in malls. Obviously, retail has been in flux for a variety of reasons, whether it has ranged from the impact of internet shopping and e-commerce to COVID itself. How would analyses like CDSTEP, the 5 C's, 5 forces, inform Macy's strategies? And based off of this, particularly off of a TOES analysis, what are the key issues that you think Macy's should address? And in doing this, you should get a better sense of how these 4 tools can help marketers identify marketing strategy.